Would you believe me if I told you that a mother, kneeling in silence, was able to change the fate of her 3 children, even without knowing where they were, even without receiving a single phone call, even when everyone told her it was too late? Because that's exactly what you're about to witness. This isn't a story about religion, it's about active faith. It's about the kind of love that doesn't shout, but insists. That doesn't demand, but persists. That doesn't control, but trusts. And that, above all, never gives up while the world teaches us to be hard, cold, and short-sighted. Susan, an ordinary mother with calloused hands and a soul full of hope, chose the opposite path. She chose to believe when everything said otherwise. She chose to forgive when she had every reason to rebel. And most of all, she chose to pray every day, even without an answer. Some would call this foolishness, others naivete. But what you'll see here is living proof that there's wisdom hidden in those who love in silence. Brace yourself, because this story will challenge your beliefs about time, limits, and miracles. It will show you that fear, loneliness, and even the deepest guilt can be healed when someone chooses to act with compassion. That the power of kindness, even invisible, moves with a force that not even the cruelest pain can stop. And yes, the impossible surrenders to the faith of a mother. On her knees, a faith that crossed borders, touched lost souls, and restored what seemed destroyed. This is more than a moving narrative. It's a mirror, an invitation to reflection. A true inspiration for mothers, fathers, children, siblings, for all of us who have ever thought of giving up. Because while she prayed for her children, the miracle happened. And perhaps, if you listen with an open heart, something will begin to happen inside you too. Susan always had hands calloused by toil and a heart softened by faith. Widowed at an early age, she found herself alone with 3 young children, facing the storm without even an umbrella to protect her, only the strength of resilience that springs from those who love unconditionally. The world was not kind to her. She lacked money, her health failed occasionally, and loneliness made its home in the left-hand corner of the living room. But still, every morning and every night, Susan knelt on the same worn rug and said, with a mixture of hope and courage, "Protect my children, Lord. May they not be lost." No one saw, no one knew, but there, in that silent room, a spiritual war was being waged. And her weapon? The power of kindness. Her armor, faith combined with perseverance. Deep down, she understood that life doesn't always yield flowers, but that the most fertile fertilizer is love watered with tears. Even in fear, she continued, and that, in itself, was an act of heroism amid overdue bills that seemed to multiply like rabbits, and an emptiness that hurt most on Sunday afternoons. Susan sustained her household not only with the meager change she earned from her work as a seamstress, but with the silent generosity of a heart that never tires of loving. When food was scarce, she shared what little she had, and when someone knocked on her door asking for help, she offered what she had, with humility and empathy. Some neighbors whispered, thinking she had gone mad. But those who see from the outside often don't understand the language of those who live by faith. Susan didn't expect a reward. She knew, with the wisdom of someone who has seen pain firsthand, that love is a seed that blooms in its own time. Her trust was not in what the eyes saw, but in what her heart intuited. She clung to understanding, even when loneliness screamed. And when she lay down at night, she lay down with the certainty that she was doing everything she could, and maybe a little more. There was something almost magical about the way Susan approached life, not out of naivete, but out of emotional intelligence. Instead of rebelling, she transformed each setback into a new opportunity to offer more affection. Instead of complaining, she prayed. And her prayers weren't mechanical, they were soulful dialogues, Conversations between a wounded woman and a God she felt heard her, even in the harshest silence. While many closed themselves off in pain, she opened the windows of hope. Instead of hardening, she softened even more, as if the pain didn't break her, but molded her. This is wisdom, allowing scars to teach rather than define. With her intelligence, Susan intuited that reconciliation with life begins within, and that forgiveness is the first step. There were days when she cried alone, of course, but she soon rose. Because for her, each prayer was like a seed sown in the darkness, and no matter how long the night was, she felt the dawn was coming. Time, that invisible sculptor, was shaping Susan's children in unexpected directions. What had once been laughter in the kitchen and running through the hallways gradually transformed into closed doors, curt answers, and screaming silences. Joe, the oldest, began falling in with bad company and soon plunged into the underworld of the streets. Anne, the youngest, always sensitive, lost herself amid conflicts and a desperate search for belonging. And Ben, the middle child, once the most affectionate, fell into the clutches of drugs. Susan saw everything, felt everything, but it was like shouting into an open field without an echo. The home, once full of life, now echoed with absences. But even so, with tears in her eyes, she knelt courageously and said, "They may have left me, but God will never leave them." It was there, between pain and hope, that her faith grew stronger. Susan understood, with the wisdom of someone who has faced darkness, that the human heart is a road with many forks, and that often, out of fear, insecurity, or disillusionment, we choose dangerous shortcuts. But she also knew that no distance is too far for love to reach. With each absence of her children, she responded with more prayer, more empathy, more compassion. She never judged, never pointed the finger. She understood that behind every mistake lies a hidden pain begging for understanding. And that is precisely where the power of kindness operates most powerfully. Susan didn't give up. She wrote letters, even when she knew they might never be read. She left voicemails, even if no one returned them. Because deep down, she knew, seeds of affection don't die, they just sleep until the right time to blossom. And as much as the silence was torture, Susan chose to believe every day. To believe that her children, even lost, still had within them the spark of humanity she had so lovingly planted. It's easy to love when everything is going well. It's hard to maintain kindness when the world becomes a minefield. But she remained steadfast with a rare blend of humility and initiative. In fact, this is perhaps the secret of the strong, persisting when everything tells her to give up. Susan invested in the invisible, and this is the kind of investment that never fails: prayer, patience, active faith. If you're experiencing something similar, it's worth remembering. Keep your heart open, without losing your steadfastness. Create small daily rituals, a note on the door, a silent hug, a look without demands, because sometimes it's in this small gesture that the door to reconciliation opens. And deep down, Susan knew the silence wouldn't last forever. Something was about to break. The days dragged by slowly, as if every second were a reminder that something was missing. Susan would spend hours staring at the phone, almost as if she were silently talking to it. There was a pain hard to name, a mixture of emptiness, disappointment, and a twinge of hope that insisted on not dying. The letters returned with the dreaded phrase, "addressee unknown," and the neighbors, always well-intentioned, asked about her children in that awkward voice of someone who fears the answer. Susan smiled sweetly, but her eyes betrayed the truth. "They're fine. They're under God's protection," she would reply. But at night, when no one was looking, the tears came like a dammed river. She wept on her knees and prayed with a fervor, bordering on despair, and yet she wouldn't give in. It was in this silence that her resilience grew like an invisible root. There's no sound more terrifying than the silence of those we love. Susan lived that sound every day. The house, which once vibrated with life, now felt like a capsule of memories. Her children's clothes were still folded in the drawers. Ben's favorite dish, the smell of Anne's shampoo, Joe's worn cap on the hanger, everything remained there, untouched, like a silent altar of affection and hope. But Susan knew that, even without answers, her prayers had a purpose. Because those who sow love and perseverance are not frustrated, they mature. And through her tears, she also laughed. She laughed to herself, remembering the small gestures, the funny phrases, the mischief of childhood. Because laughing was also a way of keeping the connection alive. And keeping the connection alive is an act of faith. Faith in return, in transformation, in reconciliation. Faith of those who, even in silence, still listen with their hearts. Susan also understood that her children's silence was not a punishment. It was perhaps a choked cry of someone who didn't know how to return. And so, she decided to be even kinder. She began keeping a prayer journal, a letter a day to each child. I wrote what I wanted to say if I were looking into their eyes. Son, you are light, even in dark times. Daughter, I love you with all my strength, even from afar. This, my friend, is the power of emotional intelligence combined with practical wisdom. A simple gesture anyone can do. Write, even if no one reads. Pray, even if no one listens. Because what heals is not the immediate response, but the sincere act of staying present, even when the other is absent. And as Susan did this, a restlessness began to blossom within her, something subtle, almost imperceptible. As if the silence were about to give way to a new sound. On that cold November dawn, Susan woke suddenly, as if summoned by something inaudible. The clock read 3:17 a.m. Still drowsy, she sat on the edge of the bed, her heart racing, feeling a strange peace, unlike anything she had ever felt. She still remembered the dream vividly. A long dark road, surrounded by shadows, and suddenly, a golden light appeared on the horizon, breaking through the darkness. There, on that road, she saw Joe, Ben, and Anne walking, heads down but heading toward the light. No words were spoken, but Susan woke with the unmistakable feeling that the miracle was on its way. It was as if, even before she saw it, she was already touching the transformation. And that, my friends, is a rare kind of wisdom, the kind cultivated with faith, intuition, and courage. Susan understood, with her keen emotional intelligence, that the heart sometimes anticipates events before reality manifests. It's like a mother who senses her child's illness before the thermometer registers a fever, or like someone who senses the absence of a hug even when surrounded by people. This sixth sense, born of deep compassion, spiritual connection, and true love, was the silent compass that guided Susan. From that early morning on, she began to pray differently. No longer with tears of pain, but with words of gratitude. In her prayers, she already gave thanks for what she hadn't yet seen. Thank you, Lord, that my children are returning, because they are already saved, even though they are far from my sight. This is trust. This is living by faith. And you can apply this to your own life. Exchange despair for anticipatory gratitude. Write letters of thanks to the universe for what hasn't yet arrived, but already exists in potential. The following days were filled with a lightness that even Susan couldn't explain. She went back to sewing and singing, as she had when her children still lived with her. The plants on the porch, previously dry, began to bloom, as if responding to the new atmosphere. Even the neighbors noticed the change. You look different, Susan, they said, and she just smiled. Because when the heart feels, the soul prepares. And there, in the shadows of the invisible, Susan rediscovered what the world had tried to steal from her: hope, trust in life, in the timing of things, in the silent persistence that one day bears fruit. Sometimes life tests our patience too, strengthen our faith. And it was in this atmosphere that the unexpected began to unfold. Not with noise, but with that silence that precedes a great turning point. The sun had barely broken the sky that Tuesday morning when Susan heard 3 knocks on the door. It wasn't the mailman, nor the curious neighbor. When she opened it, her heart nearly stopped. There, before her, was Ben, the one in the middle. Thin, with a haggard face, worn clothes, and eyes sunk in a sea of regret, he seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. Not a word was spoken for a few seconds. And then, as if time had returned to childhood, he fell to his knees and said, "Mom, your prayers have brought me back." It was impossible to contain his emotion. Susan fell to her knees too and enveloped him in a hug that seemed to bring all the broken pieces together. That scene was not just the reunion of mother and son, it was the embodiment of perseverance, unconditional love, and untiring faith. It was the first tangible response to what she had been planting with resilience for years. Ben told his story through sobs. He said that, at the height of his addiction, he had met a missionary in a rehab clinic. The man handed him a loaf of bread and said, "Someone out there is still praying for you." That struck deep, like an arrow of light piercing the darkness. And that was when everything began to change. Ben decided to be hospitalized, faced withdrawal, trauma, and fear. And at each stage, he heard his mother's voice echoing in his memory. "I love you, my son." It was fuel. A constant reminder that, even from a distance, he never stopped being loved. It was this silent affection, combined with the faith that moves mountains, that brought him back. Susan, her eyes shining with tears, and pride, knew this wasn't just the return of a son. It was confirmation that persistent kindness can work miracles that logic can't explain. In the days that followed, the house once again smelled of fresh coffee and warm bread in the morning. Ben, still fragile, began helping his mother with the chores, fixing what was broken, as if symbolically he were also trying to fix himself. And Susan, with her loving wisdom, didn't demand, didn't question. She simply welcomed with humility and emotional intelligence. She knew that forgiveness is a process and that each act of reconciliation was a silent victory. Together, they began to pray every night. And it was there, between holding hands and simple prayers, that Susan sensed something greater was coming. If faith could bring back a son who was thought lost, what else was possible? Reuniting with Ben was like the first page of a new chapter, a chapter she sensed, in her heart, would bring even more surprises. After Ben's return, the atmosphere in the house took on a new glow. Susan, still moved by the miracle she had experienced, intensified her prayers for her other 2 children. Now she no longer prayed with desperation, but with confidence. With each candle lit, each word whispered to heaven, there was a certainty. More miracles were on the way. Sitting at the table with Ben, she reached out, closed her eyes, and said with faith, "Lord, reach and touch Joe's heart. I know you've already begun the work." It was the kind of prayer that spanned miles, cut through heartache and pain. And then, one ordinary morning, the phone rang, and this time, it wasn't an advertisement. On the other end, a trembling voice said, "Mom, it's me, Ann." Susan's heart nearly leaped from her chest. It was her daughter, alive, crying, wanting to return. Ann told her she'd had a dream. In it, she saw her mother kneeling, praying for her, tears streaming down her face. She woke with a start, her chest tight, as if she'd been hugged from afar. That woke her up. Alone, In a distant city, without real friends, with a weary soul, she picked up the phone and dialed. She said, "Mom, I felt something calling me home. Something strong, as if love was pulling me back." Susan, her face bathed in tears, simply replied, "What you felt was prayer reaching me." The reconnection with Anne was gentle, like a breeze after a storm. There was no judgment, only understanding and affection. Susan knew that for reconciliation to be complete, she needed to make space within herself, and she did. With everything. Because love doesn't fragment, it expands out in the following days. Susan prepared Anne's room, reorganized the house, and cooked her daughter's favorite dishes. It was as if every detail said, "You are expected, you are loved, you belong." Ben and Anne, together again, began to reminisce about their childhood, sharing guilt, pain, and secrets. It was beautiful to see a dance of forgiveness and acceptance. Susan watched with a joyful heart, and with the wise gaze of someone who understands that true healing happens in shared affection. Now, with 2 children back, she was even more certain. The power of kindness knows no bounds, and prayer, when offered with sincerity, reaches further than any bridge. But even amidst the joy, there was an empty seat at the table. Joe was still, far away, and Susan's heart, even at peace, knew the time for the greatest challenge had arrived. Joe was the most distant of the 3. The quietest, the most introspective, the most wounded. Since childhood, he had kept everything to himself, and when the accumulated pain found bad company, he sank into a dark world of crime, escape, and guilt. For many, there was no way back. He was the lost son, the unsolved case, the name people avoided mentioning. But not for Susan. To her, Joe was the boy who loved to climb trees and who had a sweet heart, even hidden under an armor of pain. She prayed for him with a kind of faith that defied logic, the faith that persists when everything says it's over. And one day, Ben came into the living room with a letter in his hands, his eyes wide. "Mom, it's from Joe." Susan felt her legs weaken. The handwriting was his. The short message said, "I'm surrendering. I'm tired. I want to start over." It was more than news. It was the impossible bending before persistent prayer. Joe had decided to surrender after watching a video on his cell phone of an ex-convict who now preached in communities. The man spoke about love, reconciliation, and said it's never too late. Joe cried when he heard the phrase, "You may be trapped on the outside, but you can still be free on the inside." It was in that moment that he felt his mother's presence, as if being embraced from afar. He wrote the letter soon after, and that same day, he went to the police station. In prison, he found a support and prayer group. Sitting in a circle with other men broken by life, he began to speak. For the first time, he shared his mistakes, his traumas, his losses. He was heard. And there, in an environment where many see only condemnation, Joe experienced something rare: compassion. For the first time, he felt forgiven. Not by human justice, but by a love that penetrates walls. Months passed, and Susan received another letter. This time, written more calmly, Joe said, "Mom, today I understand. You never gave up on me. I'm changing. I'm not free here yet, but I am free inside." Susan read the letter with trembling hands. But with a firm heart, she knew. She knew that true freedom begins within. That forgiveness is more powerful than any sentence. That faith is a seed that blooms even in concrete. Joe still had a long way to go, but the most important thing had already happened. He had found himself again. And with that, Susan felt her mission as a mother was being fulfilled. Not without pain, not without failures, but with love, perseverance, humility, and above all, hope. And the most beautiful thing is that, even inside prison, Joe began to pray for other inmates, as if he knew, deep down, that this miracle wasn't just his. It was a sunny Sunday, with clear skies and light air, one of those days when it seems even time kneels in reverence. Susan walked toward the neighborhood church, her steps slow and her heart racing. As she walked through the door, she saw a scene she'd never dared imagine with her eyes open. Her 3 children, side by side, sitting in the front pew. Ben with a steady gaze, Anne with teary eyes, and Joe smiling for the first time in years, with a sparkle in his eyes that only someone rescued from themselves can have. Susan couldn't contain herself. Her legs weakened and the tears came rushing down. The entire church noticed, and in an instant, silence gave way to emotion. This wasn't just a family reunion. It was the living embodiment of faith, forgiveness, and reconciliation that transforms. There, that morning, the miracle stopped being an idea. It became flesh, tears, and an embrace. The pastor asked Susan to say something. She stood, wiping her eyes, and said in a broken but firm voice, "I prayed for years, and God answered in His time. My children have returned, not only home, but to life." The congregation was moved. Many wept. Others applauded. And there was something special about that atmosphere. It was as if everyone knew they were witnessing a true testament to resilience and the power of goodness. Susan didn't boast. With humility and sincerity, she gave glory to faith and the love that never gives up. And at that moment, her children also spoke. Ben thanked them for their prayers. Anne asked for forgiveness. Joe, his voice breaking, said, "Mom, you were my angel." And there, before everyone, pain was welcomed, mistakes were embraced, and hope was restored. It was humanity at its most beautiful, imperfect, but deeply capable of love. From that day on, the story of Susan and her children began to spread. Not as a story, but as an invitation to overcome, to transformation, and to true compassion. Because there is no greater force than a love that refuses to give up, even when all seems lost. The reunion that Sunday was not just physical. It was spiritual. It was a collective rebirth. Every tear shed there was not a sign of weakness, but of healing. And Susan, with all her wisdom gained through pain and hope, knew this was only the beginning. What life had restored now needed to be multiplied. It was time to transform all that into a mission, an initiative, a purpose. After all, when one is touched by a miracle, one cannot keep it to oneself. It was necessary to share. Because out there, so many other mothers were still praying alone. And perhaps the most powerful thing about this legacy is precisely this, showing that miracles are not made of smoke or magic, but of courage, persistence, honesty, and the power of kindness. Susan taught, with her life, that even the darkest valleys can blossom if one has the courage to love in silence, to wait patiently, to act with emotional intelligence, and to trust with humility. The seed planted by that mother on her knees has now blossomed into a forest of lives rescued, homes restored, stories rewritten. And the most impressive thing is that it all began with a simple prayer on a worn rug in a silent house. Because, as she prayed for her children, the miracle began. And it continues. Yes, it continues in every mother who refuses to give up, in every young person who chooses to start over, in every life that decides to reconnect with its own humanity. Now tell me, after everything you've heard, what still stops you from believing that change is possible? How many times have you thought about giving up on someone, something, or even yourself because you thought it was too late? What if, like Susan, you decided to persist a little longer? What if, instead of giving in to fear, you used faith as a tool? It doesn't have to be a religious faith. It just needs to be a living faith, one that believes in love, reconciliation, forgiveness, the power of hope, and the wisdom of time. How many lives could you touch if you stopped waiting for perfect conditions and started acting with empathy right now? How many doors would open if you chose kindness over indifference? Susan's story isn't a distant tale, it's a road that lies before us all. Will you move forward with more courage, or will you allow fear to dictate your choices? Will you continue to remain silent, or will you take the initiative, write that message, make that phone call, start that prayer you've been putting off? If this story touched you, if it ignited something inside, don't let it die. Apply it. Practice it. Share it. And of course, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay with us. Here, you'll continue to find stories that nourish the heart, awaken the soul, and remind you of what truly matters. Because sometimes, all we need is a real story to start writing our own.